So I am currently a member of Gabriella, which there's a local chapter in Seattle. And Gabriella is part of a national alliance of other Gabriella chapters that we have all over the US. I think we have 11. I'm one of the founding members of Gabriella here. And what we do is we really educate Filipino women about the issues that are happening in the Philippines and then connect it to what they're experiencing here in the US, either as a child of a migrant themselves, or a worker, and trying to understand like why this pattern of migration, forcing so many of our people out of the homeland, like how does that impact them? What does that do to the country itself? And like, what's the solution? So in essence, that's Gabriella's work. And then beyond that, most of my time is leading an organization called the International Women's Alliance. So that's an international alliance of different grassroots women's organizations all around the world, all with a common purpose of trying to liberate themselves from a number of issues: labor exploitation, violence, and most of our members are rural women, like peasant women, or domestic workers, because they're sort of the majority of women that suffer the most exploitative conditions. And so my role, I'm the Secretary General, and so my role is to help coordinate all these different organizations together and learn about each other's issues, collaborate on campaigns, and actually wage an anti-imperialist struggle. So that's kind of like the main goal and objective of IWA.
So it's a pressure my head's just mentioned anti-imperialist.
Yeah.
I understand it, but talk me through what that means to you.
Yeah. So, understanding the word imperialism itself also took me a lot of just my own self-education and kind of seeing it manifested first and foremost in the Philippines, right? So really, to describe imperialism, what it is when a foreign country dominates another and imposes its will on another through various forms, like colonizing them or passing agreements or treaties that favor one over the other. It also means where you have very few people accumulate most of the wealth, right? Who make all the decisions on behalf of everyone else. And then it also means in order to grow your wealth, you need to also expand your market. And expanding markets means taking over other people's land and resources. So that's kind of all of those together is what imperialism is. And so when we say where we want to wage an anti-imperialist struggle, we want to defend people's lands. We want to defend like ancestral domains of indigenous people. We want to make sure workers are treated fairly and not just treated because everyone else is making a profit off of their cheap labor. We want to dismantle this kind of culture that prioritizes profit over people, right? And that's a lot. I mean, there's so much involved in trying to do all those things, but it really starts with education. So a lot of my work is around doing more of the education, like doing the studying different people's issues, learning from them, like how are they impacted by imperialism and what are they doing to resist it, you know? And then like getting the word out. And so sharing that story with others who need that kind of support and solidarity. It's pretty personal, like it's pretty like deeply rooted. I'm also a survivor of sexual assault and violence, and so is my mother. And so, and in every space of primarily Filipino women, Filipinx identified folks that I've come across in our organizations has some kind of story to share about being violated, right? And that's just on the personal tip. But then seeing that kind of violation and that level of violence expanded on a systematic scale, where I see hundreds of thousands of Filipino domestic workers overseas suffering, right, from rape, physical abuse from their employers. They're being starved, underpaid, or not paid at all. And seeing that on a global scale, I mean, once my eyes were open to that, I couldn't shut them out. I mean, I couldn't shut it. I just can't turn my back on it. And so that's why it's this was nothing I ever sought out at all. This was just accumulation of life experiences that sort of came full circle for me once I started learning about how imperialism works, how it's affected the Philippines, and that we can actually do something about it. We can actually change it. If people created these conditions, people can also change them. And so it's a matter of just how do you convince people that you can actually create change? And I feel that's what I do on the daily. It's just trying to convince people, if we just do our part, even a little bit, goes a long way. We do our best to integrate them as much as possible. They've grown up in rallies, meetings, drawing protest posters with us too. But they're starting to get to an age where they're starting to form their own opinions on things, and they're also kind of set their own boundaries when they don't want to attend a meeting, and we do what we can to honor that. If they're not wanting to get dragged out to a rally or an action or a meeting, we honor that as much as possible. But everyone they're surrounded by, literally they've been raised by a whole community of folks. It's not just me and Ron, the father, and my partner. We have this established three-way kind of parenting agreement that we're raising these kids together. But we also have a whole community of folks that are backing us up because we're so busy. They kind of step in and help raise the kids. And we wouldn't want it to have it any other way. I wish that this kind of support could be offered to so many other working families out there, who either have themselves, right, as the parent or two parents, and maybe some support from their immediate family. But there are so many others that don't have the kind of collective support that I think we should nurture, so that our kids can be raised in that kind of environment and not isolated, on their devices. It's still a struggle, but yeah, it's something we're very intentional about, making sure that they understand what we do. We also read books with them about Carlos Bulosan or Jose Rizal, just so they know who their people are, right, in history. And they know enough to be able to share with you their own knowledge about the Philippines. They talk about it a lot. They'll if they have a school presentation, my son will talk about the Philippines. So yeah, they know what we do, and we've explained many times to them that the work we do is important. So, but they're also kids, and they want our time, and so we also have to juggle that too, making sure we make time for them.
Kind of that reward into family.
I think they had their own vision of what they thought their children would be doing. And I went a complete different direction from what they expected. And it wasn't easy. We've gotten to many arguments about it, to a point where as much as possible, I don't engage with them too much about my politics. But they've gotten to a point where they respect my decision. They know that they can't change my mind. As long as I'm okay and the kids are taken care of, that's all that matters at this point. We're at a stage where they respect what I do. They let me do the things I need to do. And sometimes I come to them for support. This weekend, for example, I had this major webinar I had to prepare for. My partner was out fishing. And so I was I can't focus and take care of the kids and cook and do all the things. So I went home to my mom's so she could help watch the kids so I could actually focus and prepare for this webinar. So yeah, and they're glad to do that kind of stuff. Like they're happy to support. They've come through to some of our events pre-pandemic, and I have like honored my mom in previous like events, just like sharing like our narrative about that time when we met the young mother and almost adopted that baby girl, because she's a very much a part of like the narrative for me. She may not know it now, but her survival story is a story that I carry with me to better understand her and what she had to go through leaving the Philippines. You know, she was a young teenager when she immigrated here with me. And so it gave me a chance to actually understand their migration story and what they had to go through to survive here. So I didn't feel so resentful about the way that we were raised or whatever, right? I just came to an understanding, and hopefully, I mean, because my journey, they're part of it, right? They raised me. So something they did also brought me to where I am today, right? And so I want to honor and respect that. And I think they also, I hope, respect what I do now. I mean, they haven't complained about it. So yeah, so far so good. Seattle in itself already has a very rich history of Filipinos resisting, like that already in itself. And the story that comes to mind, and I don't know if it's necessarily related, but the story that comes to my mind is the assassination of Silme Domingo and Jean Biernes. They were two labor union leaders in the 70s and 80s that basically was picked off by some of Ferdinand Marcos's hired agents, right? And part of why he had them killed is that he was threatened by the solidarity support between workers here and workers in the Philippines who were experiencing a lot of just like hardcore repression. I mean, when we're talking about like worker repression, I mean, it's to the point where like people are literally dying, right? Here, the history of Filipinos, the reason why Silme and Jean were so important in their labor organizing is because they were actually trying to protect a lot of Filipinos who were working on the canneries that were traveling back and forth between Seattle and Alaska, which were some of the first jobs that Filipinos were hired on when they started immigrating here. And, you know, cheap labor, right? At the time, during the time of like the influx of Filipinos in the 20s and 30s, they could come to the US without a passport. So there were tons of them. But because of their treatment and the working conditions, the labor leaders were really hard up on like, we really got to do something to like raise the issue to an international scale. So they set up a meeting between KMU, which is the militant labor union in the Philippines, and the local ILWU, which is like the longshoremen here. And so there was this sort of like meeting that happened in the Philippines, and literally like a few months later, Jean and Silme were killed after that meeting happened. And so, and the person in the Philippines who met with the KMU folks from here was, I believe it was Jean Biernes, it was him. But the Domingo family is still very much around and active. Like Cindy and Lynn have been like staple community folks in the labor movement here. So, I mean, there's already like a plethora of resources for folks to kind of learn about their history, including like the Cordovas, right? Auntie Dorothy, and all the work that Uncle Fred has done, and like the archives that they've maintained over the years. I mean, there's so much rich history that it's sayang if people don't take advantage of that knowledge, right? I think for organizations like GAB and IWA, it's kind of taking that knowledge and history, sort of taking it up a notch by actually learning about, there's actually a civil war happening in our homeland that a lot of people don't really talk about, or it's sort of taboo, where we have an actual armed revolution happening right now to fight for our freedom. And so a lot of Filipinos would think, why? Like, aren't we a free country? Aren't we independent? We are on paper, but in reality, so much of how our government is run and so much of the decisions that are being made really uphold more the interests of like multinational corporations and like U.S. businessmen and the U.S. government, who's really trying to keep the Philippines controlled, because where the Philippines is located strategically in the West Philippine Sea, between the Philippines and China, there's a major trading route where lots of cargo ships, like something like 90% of cargo goes through that. Whoever controls that trading route controls a large percentage of the market, right? And so if we're talking about imperialism, of course, the US, touting itself as like the wealthiest nation in the world, the strongest military, is doing whatever it can to make sure it is like friendly to its little brown brother, the Philippines, so that it could control that trading route. But here comes China, who's now like a rival to US corporate interests, who's now also trying to like, take over that sea and claiming it for themselves. So now there's this tension between the US and China, with the Philippines sort of like, money from the US, money from China, like all these different like investments pouring in. And it just paves the way for more corruption in the Philippine government. So that, yeah, I mean, and a lot of people don't follow this, they don't follow like sort of this like pattern that's happening outside of like our local communities. And I think part of our role is to make those connections. And with IWA, it's not just about the Philippines. It's like, this is happening everywhere. Like this sort of pattern of like controlling underdeveloped countries is happening everywhere. And the more that people are educated about it, the stronger the resistance movements grow and the more that it's exposed, so that things can change. The hope is that we can actually bridge all the different women's movements together, ideally strategically in one place, on a specific target. And when I say target, I mean like whether it's like a bad corporation or like a bad government, right? Where we want to like really confront. That's kind of the long term, is like we really want to build this like mass movement of women, right? Who are like calling for all these changes internationally. In the short term right now, we're still doing a lot of the education. I mean, we're doing tons of webinars, learning from different folks from like Palestine, Kurdistan, Kashmir, even locally, like Black liberation movements in this country, and like what are they aiming to do, and just a lot of learning from each other, and then analysis building, so that people can be informed about, how to take action. So that's kind of the bulk of our work now, is just that, mostly learning.
All right, this is the mission.
Yeah.
What is the eventual hope? What does
I don't want to get
too
too romantic in terms of
Yeah.
say about like end goal?
Mm-hmm.
What does
success or victory look like,
Yeah.
for us, obviously for our women.
Yeah. Well, victory for me means that we don't have to have or hear another story of women being violated, being assaulted, that women can actually live free from exploitation, from violence, violence in the home, in the community or in the workplace. And that they can be viewed as an equal force, right, to their male counterparts. Because as much as we want to believe that women have advanced in terms of their civil liberties and social status, there may be like some advancements in very particular countries, but in general, I think there's still a very wide gender gap, and not just women, like other oppressed genders, right? Like including LGBTQ folks, that all of those, because these are just like attitudes and beliefs shaped by society. It's not like these are not inherent weaknesses of women. It's just how women were perceived to be over time. And I can go on and on about that, how that developed even historically. But that's the vision, is emancipating women from all chains of oppression.